Kirk Perry is president of Global Client and Agency Solutions for Google. Now, you can see a more in-depth bio in your app. But prior to beginning his career at Google, Kirk spent 23 years with a hometown favorite here in Cincinnati, and that's the Procter & Gamble organization, including serving as president of Global Family Care. He has also served as director of other organizations, including Louisville Slugger, not too far from where we are. Serves on several nonprofit boards as well. Highly regarded family in the city of Cincinnati, in the business world, and certainly now as a leadership position in Google. And by the way, Google is one of our newest members to the Construction Users Roundtable. And I'm told by my staff that they are very, very engaged. And it's with great joy that I share one of the most generous people that I know in our area and in our industry now, and taking a more prominent role in our industry as we try to figure out what to do with the data that's being generated and how do we make better decisions using the data. So again, joining us from Google, president of Google Client and Agency Solutions, Kirk Perry. Kirk, it's all yours. So glad to have you right now. Take it away.
Full background is a hotel room in Cincinnati, Ohio, where we've had 6 inches of snow. We're in town visiting my college guy. So it is not the best background. Amy had a way better background with shoes and everything behind her. The second thing is I am not an expert in your industry, far from it. But I'm hopeful that I can share some concepts, some ideas that transcend industry. I spent 23 years at Procter & Gamble before joining Google 7 years ago. I grew up as a marketer, a general manager, an operator, and now on the digital side, a leader of an organization that helps the world's largest advertisers and agencies maximize their impact online. And so for me, what I want to be able to do is share ideas, because I don't know about you, but I learn a ton from other people and other industries. So I'm hopeful that as you hear some of these things I'll share, there'll be concepts that you can relate back to your business. It's always generally not a good practice to share with your audience that you don't know their industry as well as they do. But I'm hopeful these ideas will transcend. And because I'm a Google employee, Zoom or Microsoft Teams don't download into our systems. So they're going to be running my presentation for me. And so I'll have to ask them to switch slides. So I apologize in advance for the annoying Google technology in the background that's not letting me run it directly from my laptop. So guys, if you could take it away. Now here is a super attractive picture of me, my first day at Google. If you've ever seen the movie The Intern, The Internship, the guys wear the hats, Owen Wilson, and Vince Vaughn. They wear their hats with little twirlies on top. Yes, we wear those our first day at Google, which always makes for exciting first days and stories and future blackmail pictures, I'm sure, from one of my 4 kids. But I don't know about you, but one of the interesting things when you change a job or a company even, when you come in, you'll ask questions like, why was that decision made in the way that it was? Or why wasn't a decision made in the way I think it should be? And I love this quote on the next slide. And it's from a guy named James Balog. And he talks about the fact that hindsight can be merciless. If you could switch the slide, guys. People of any given era often look back in time and wonder how their predecessors could have been so dim-witted. I love that because it's so true, right? We wonder why things were done a certain way and why they weren't. And it's one of the reasons that it was so interesting for me when I first came to Google. Because after 23 years at Procter, when I'd go into a meeting with a CEO or a COO or a business unit president, the door would shut and they'd say, hey, I know you work at Google now, but man, you got to share with me how this world would have looked different for you if you'd take what you know now and could wind the clock back. I got that question, not exactly worded the same way every single time, but generally, what could you have done differently had you taken the new knowledge of your industry back with you? And so that really translated into something, next slide, please, for me around, boy, if I could have rewound the clock, and knowing then what I know now, what would I have changed? And again, I'm not sure about you and your industry specifically, but it is way harder to change when things are going well than when things are going sideways, right? You don't want to disrupt success. You're like, hey, the machine's rolling, we've got things working. Why would I want to make a change? Why would I want to do things differently than the success model that I've built? And I'll talk a minute about why the world is littered with companies that say that same thing. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about where the puck is headed. And this is a picture. I'm not a huge hockey fan, but I'm sure there are some on this call. Wayne Gretzky, the great one. There was an interview about him in Sports Illustrated many, many years ago. And the interviewer said, hey, you're not the biggest, you're not the fastest. How did you become the greatest? And he's a humble guy, so he demurred and talked about the fact that for him, if he were the strongest, he could muscle his way down the court, or down the rink, down the ice. And that would be great until someone stronger came along and obviated his advantage. Or if he were the fastest, he could outskate people down the ice until someone faster came along and would completely negate his competitive advantage. So he said, the thing I do is I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is today. And that to me is such an apt metaphor for any business, whether it's the construction industry, the tech industry, the CPG industry. It is, to me, the mantra of the most successful companies in the world. They skate where it's going to be. They don't skate with the puck by their side down the ice. So I'm drawing my inspiration from, on the next slide, from our favorite, at least my favorite, my namesake, sci-fi action figure, and that's Captain Kirk. And I always told my parents, you name me after him. No, we didn't name you after him. The show was on before you were born. Well, these dates prove that they named me after him. So, but I thought one of the interesting things was, back in the 1960s, you see something that looks an awful lot like a Razor flip phone that many of us owned a decade or so ago. If you move to the next slide, tablet computing. This was from 2001, A Space Odyssey. This was back in the late 1960s. You see the equivalent of what we use today with iPads or tablets. This was foreshadowed through tech. The next slide, though, to me, talks about something super interesting from a futuristic tech standpoint, and that was the Jetsons. We're going down cartoon lane right now, but this first aired in 1962. In fact, the end of September 1962. It was, interestingly, the first all-color primetime cartoon in history. And I'll talk about a fun fact about this, but it was, back in the day, only 3% of US televisions that had color capacity and capability. Which meant 97% of people saw this in black and white, which meant that it was only a one-season show. Interestingly, I don't know about you, but as a kid growing up, I felt like there were 500 episodes of the Jetsons. There were actually only 24 of the original Jetsons episode, which is interesting. But it was set 100 years into the future. It was supposed to be 2062, which interestingly isn't that far from where we are today. Another 40 years will be in the future that the Jetsons predicted. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of go by, kind of technology by technology. If you take a look at the next slide around, what they foreshadowed for us, what was coming. I used to have a finance manager at Procter. His name was Dan Hotelling, the best finance leader I've ever worked with. And he used to say, my job is to help you look around corners so we can see those buses coming that may run us over when we turn that corner. So how do we avoid those buses, or how do we see them coming and make sure that we get out ahead of them better so that we don't have an accident? So these things were coming. They were foreshadowed. The personal computer, right? So George and Elroy sitting, looking at their personal computer back in the early 1960s. Thomas Watson famously said the world has a capacity for about 5 personal computers. Billions of personal computers later, we know that was a false prediction. Next slide, video chat. Whether it's Google Meet or Skype or we're on Zoom, Microsoft Teams, whatever the video chat service. George and his wife Jane utilized the technology back in 1962. We saw it coming. Or the next slide, wearable computing. When you look at the picture of that looks like more Fred Flintstone. But if you look at that, you see on the other side what is now an Apple Watch. And we know how big that has become and how many people actually have those connected to their phone. The next slide, flying cars. We don't have flying cars right now, but interestingly, we have a lot of self-driving cars, at least a lot of technology in place to enable self-driving cars down the road. But again, we're 42 years away from 2062. There is a lot of work going on right now on hovercraft vehicles that could actually come to fruition. Next slide, push button living. One of the things about the Jetsons was George only worked 3 hours a day because the world was so automated. Wouldn't that be fantastic to only work 3 hours a day and have the world automated? Most of the chores on the show were just a push button away, just to press away. In fact, his wife, Jane, if you guys recall, used to do finger workouts every day because of all the push button activity she had in her home. That other picture, interestingly, was the very first remote from 1956, the Zenith. I used to joke, I was born, a decade or so after that. And I used to joke that I was my dad's personal remote control because I would have to get up and change the TV to one of the 8 channels that we had. And I'd adjust the dog ears to make sure that whatever channel, anybody under 40 doesn't get the dog ears reference, but those of us more wisdom-filled citizens in the crowd remember adjusting dog ears to make sure we could see our selected channel, which is a little bit different today. But anyway, that used ultrasound and mechanical vibration to change the channel and volume. So it actually might have influenced the Jetsons versus the other way around. But as we stop and look in the next slide at what the future is going to look like, one of my absolute favorite Robert Downey Jr. roles is Iron Man. And if you think about what the 3D experience was in that movie, we called Jarvis, right? So we've evolved. All of these predictions that were in the Jetsons are coming to fruition or have come to fruition and come to pass. As we start to look at what sci-fi is showing us today, what is it? In Iron Man, Jarvis, the 3-dimensional CGI world where things are formed, created, and modeled in real-time 3D, is coming. Ambient computing is part of that future. The ability to create things in space. I mean, we're working right now at Google on things where you won't need a device. You won't need a phone. You won't need a everything will be holograms, if you will. So walls will become, the ambient computing space and features that we need. So very much like we saw in Jarvis. So why is this important? So this is the last slide here. And since I can't see anybody and ask this question, last slide in the section, I should say, if you guys could bring it up on that would be great. So one of the things I do when I speak in front of a group is I will ask people if they're able to remember owning a BlackBerry, and every hand will go up without question. And then I'll ask people if they remember using Netscape Navigator, which was the first and most dominant web browser, and every hand goes up. Or Alta Vista, which was the first search engine, and every hand goes up. Now, with the exception of 1 or 2 users of BlackBerries, almost in every crowd, and people say, they still have theirs from like 2008, but I like the keyboard is what they'll say about the BlackBerry technology. But the fact of the matter is, for these 3 companies, they are they are non-existent. But don't you think that RIM, who was the parent company of BlackBerry, saw that the iPhone was going to forever change the landscape in handhelds? Do you think Netscape probably saw Microsoft Internet Explorer coming along is going to be disruptive to their business, or Google Chrome, or Alta Vista? Did they see this little search engine called Google that popped up into the horizon a little over 20 years ago that was pretty nondescript, but that was super effective at pulling up queries? Why didn't these businesses change? Why didn't they adapt and plan for the future? And that's the thing to me that is most intriguing about this whole proposition of what would you have done differently. The first thing for me is spending more time thinking about where we're headed and what's coming around the corner that could run us over, which again, I'm not as familiar with your industry, so I apologize, but I am certain that there are things on the horizon for you that are going to be cataclysmic for the industry, that are going to be disruptive beyond compare and belief. And people are innovating against that right now, whether they're simple, small point players, whether they're big, huge corporations. People are going to disrupt your industry as you know it today. So the question is, do you do it to yourself or does someone do it to you? Next slide, please. I'm going to skip the video if you don't mind, and we'll move on to the following slide after that. So the other thing that I would have done, kind of the second thing, is I would have embraced this notion of end-to-end digitization more immediately versus incrementally. And of course, you know, the side-by-side of the horse and buggy and the Ferrari is good for metaphorical sake. But the reality is, when I was at Procter & Gamble, we were a very big, global, progressive company by CPG standards. You know, in fact, toward the end of my tenure there, we were in a big digitization phase. We would have a room on the top floor of our general offices in downtown Cincinnati, and we put all these monitors up, and we're trying to visualize data and be able to do things in real time and speed up that process. But when I left that meeting, I would carry my 2 fact books that weighed about 8 pounds each with tons of paper in them down to my office, where I would go to a meeting in a meeting room next door where people would hand out 30-page PowerPoint decks in slide form. Then I would print out my emails when I would fly across the world to meet some of my orgs in different locations so that I could handwrite them, and then I would fax them back to my office, and my assistant would either scan them in and send them back out or would hand deliver them. I mean, talk about how flippin' crazy that was. When I walked in the door to Google, I hardly ever saw a piece of paper anywhere. The entire ecosystem of how we work is designed digitally. And it's a choice. It's a very intentional choice. I have 0 fact books. Everything I have is on my computer. Notes are taken on tablets or on computers. You know, I used to have a policy when I was at P&G in my meetings. I'm like, lids down. I don't want anybody not paying attention. I want to respect people. When I came to Google, I was like, oh my gosh, everybody's got their computer up. They must be doing email. No, they're taking notes. They're making sure they're capturing in real time. As soon as meetings were over there, summaries go out. Here, I should say. When I was at P&G, we take a couple days to compile our handwritten notes onto the computer and send them back off. You know, when you think about end-to-end digitization, it's making sure that you're connected to your consumers. You know, I joke, I travel, I have 2.5 million miles on Delta. So I've spent the last 30 plus years traveling the world, and that doesn't count the other hundreds of thousands of miles I have on other airlines. I'm not proud of that, to be clear, but I have a lot of airline miles. But I couldn't have told you one CEO's name of an airline, not one, as much as I've traveled. But I have gotten to know them all pretty personally since the pandemic started, because they're sending me emails every month. They're keeping in contact with me, telling me how clean their planes are, how sanitized they are, how they're rolling over my frequent flyer status to the end of 2021. And like all of these things have occurred because they're interacting with me a lot more. They have embraced this notion of end-to-end digitization because they want to be quicker and respond to consumer needs faster. And so one of the things about this is you have to decide, and it is a declaration, because my portfolio of partners is the biggest advertisers in the world, the biggest advertising agencies in the world. These are multi-billion-dollar businesses, and they are such a spectrum of their digitization efforts. But the ones who've embraced it, the ones who've declared it, the ones who've managed it from the top and demand it from their organizations are the furthest ahead, get the best results, are generally the most efficient because they want to operate in a different way. And it comes from us role modeling it, declaring it, and following through on it. Next slide, please. The other thing I would have done is embraced the cloud first party data centric orientation of the world way earlier. Again, when I was at Procter, we had our own servers. Every business unit kind of had their own data collection strategy. So we would literally have the brands doing their own permissioning. So if a consumer said, yes, I want to be on the Pampers mailing list, we couldn't send them any information about Tide or any information about Bounty or any information about Downy because they only said, I want to get information from Pampers. That information was all stored separately. So there was no commingling of databases. There was no connectivity at all. And in your world, in this world that we're in now, first party data is going to be the orientation of the world. And if you don't have a personal relationship with your customers, with your consumers going forward, the world is going to look so different. I mean, in the advertising world, for example, right now, cookies, the way we are all communicated to online. So when you go to a website, a cookie will attach itself to your unique identifier and it will follow you around. That's why when you're somewhere and you're looking up, you're on Facebook and you jump off because a product popped up and you go and look that product up, Facebook knows that you went and looked up, maybe even if you bought that product. That's what a cookie does. Cookies are going away. By the end of next year, there will be no cookies and there's going to be more stringent data laws. And we, or one of our policies at Google is we want to make sure consumers consent from a privacy standpoint to how their data is being used. Because one of the things about the free and open web is that it's a contract between a consumer and a company. And how many of you have paid for anything, from a Google standpoint, unless you went to Google Play and bought something, of course, but Gmail's free. YouTube is free, unless you buy a premium subscription. Google Maps is free. Waze is free. If you go down the list, there's a lot of free stuff, but the exchange for that, the value exchange, is that advertising will be more relevant and meaningful to you. That's how the free and open web works. But going forward, that's going to be more challenging for reaching consumers, because if a consumer doesn't consent, if a customer doesn't consent to be communicated with, you're not going to be able to reach them. So the traditional way of communicating, of advertising, of connecting are going to change. However, if you have a first-party direct data relationship with your customers and your consumers, you will be able to stay connected with them. And that's the power of this, what I call cloud first-party data-centric orientation. It is an end-to-end philosophy. It's a strategy. And I know, saw a little bit of Amy's presentation earlier. A lot of the power of the cloud is the ability to amass data, to leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence so that you can power through that data, make faster, more efficient and effective decisions, but then ultimately stay more connected to and understand behaviors and changes to your consumer and customer base. So it's going to be a critically important thing going forward. And again, in my old world, this was an afterthought. In our future world, in our future state, being cloud first and really thinking about a first-party data strategy, one where it's written down, one where it's communicated to the entire company, one where it's followed, is going to be really critical. Next slide, please. So this is one that I would tell you, think about this in relation to your industry. What's a parallel thought? What's a revolution that's occurred in my industry? It's the mobile revolution, right? We went from having computer, tablet oriented businesses to all of a sudden consumers were spending more time on their mobile device, more time on their mobile device than any other device at all. In fact, the next slide shows you the difference, I think, starkly. The picture on the left is from 2005. It was the papal inauguration. Just look at that for a second. Just a bunch of people looking at the Pope getting inaugurated. On the right, same thing 8 years later. And I don't know about you, but how many concerts have you been at where you are so annoyed at the person in front of you because they have their cell phone up the whole time, taking video of the concert that they're at and should be absorbing. So it's just a personal diatribe on the side there. But it's amazing because the world has become so different with a mobile device. We know, next slide, please, that a consumer pulls out that phone out of their pocket 150 times a day. 150 times a day. We have more danger of wearing our front pockets out than we do our back pockets wallets these days. And we know, for example, that for 97% of millennials, a mobile device is the first thing they touch in the morning and the last thing they touch at night. This is the way the world communicates with each other. This is how the world is connected. Revolutionary change. Revolutionary change in the way the world connects. So, next slide. This is an example of a company that leveraged this dramatic change in India, where the mobile revolution took a little bit longer to come to fruition. So this company called Paytm decided the banking industry, think about banking in general, the most direct linkage to consumers when it comes to their money, right? You deposit money, you have checking accounts, you have ATM cards. The banks have relationships directly with consumers. Well, in India, they made a bold move to kind of clean up the currency. In fact, they eliminated currency in a lot of ways because of the black market in that, avoidance of taxes, and went directly to pay systems that were non-cash based. This small startup company called Paytm jumped over the traditional banking industry. Back to my earlier point about BlackBerries. They saw this coming before it happened. They anticipated that the pivot would happen very quickly. So they built a system that allows Indian consumers to do anything with this device. This is to pay for movie tickets. This is to pay for something at a kiosk from a street vendor. And this is a couple years old now, but they have 65% of the Indian population on their app. They completely jumped the traditional banking system. They saw the revolution coming and they jumped to it. And I would just challenge you with this thought. What is an equivalent in your industry where there is something that's bubbling up that you feel in your gut is going to be big, that will eventually overtake traditional systems, and it's going to happen? What would you do differently? What would you do, regardless of the time, effort, or cost, to make sure you didn't get behind the eight ball? Because frankly, a lot of the reason the banks didn't want to change, because it was a significant infrastructure investment in India to do this, right? To build this out. And they didn't want to do it. So this small startup got the funding to actually do it. So what's the equivalent in the construction industry? Next slide, please. So the other thing I would have done is created magical experiences that delighted consumers. And in your case, I would guess that it would be delighting your customers. So the next slide for me is something that's very near and dear to my heart, which are Teslas. Now, I moved out to California a little over 7 years ago from Cincinnati, Ohio. And we were looking at places. And if you know anything about real estate in California, and you're all in the construction industry, so you'll know better than I do, it is a very expensive place to live. And so we kept having to get further and further away from my office in order to find a house that we were comfortable buying. And one of my pitches to my wife was, yes, we can live 20 miles away from the office. I could brave an hour plus commuting every day, but boy, it would be nice to have a Tesla to do that. And so I convinced my wife that I should buy a Tesla, and I did. But what was very interesting about it, I'd never test driven a Tesla. I just gotten word of mouth about it. But the buying process was so unbelievably easy. You know, today, and it's improved quite a bit, but a typical OEM, auto manufacturer, when I went to buy my Tesla for the first time 6.5 years ago, it would take you 5 to 7 screens just to schedule a test drive, because you'd be on the OEM site and they'd ask you questions, and then they'd pass you off to the local dealer site, and then they would ask you questions, and you eventually get a time scheduled, or, you know, some information about coming in to do a test drive. I was able to buy my Tesla in 3 screens on a mobile device. This is not the actual Tesla I bought, but this just shows you actually bring it up and you pick your options, and then it gives you, and then you scroll down and you'll be on something that tells you what your car costs and the payment options, and then you actually place your order and put your deposit down on the 3rd screen. I can buy a relatively expensive car on a mobile device. It was a magical experience. I can summon that Tesla from my mobile app in a parking lot. Literally, it backs itself out and pulls itself around. That's being really lazy. I know you guys are thinking that, but it's just fun to do. I can also turn my car on from my app. I can actually upload and download software onto my car to update the systems. It's an amazingly, I can call them to come out and fix my tire, whatever I want to do. They have designed a system that just is a magical experience. I've now owned 2 of them, and I will be a loyal Tesla user for life, because they created an amazingly magical experience. What is the magical experience in your industry? What is the thing that people will say, oh my gosh? And as a marketer, I talk about it as being a point of difference. There's a lot of points of parity. And I remember one of the things that Amy said that really stuck to me is, hey, if you want to be the low margin commodity in your industry, maybe this isn't for you. I think about it as, you know, what are your points of difference? What are those things that are unique to you that will delight your customer? And that's something that I think a lot of times we don't always stop to think about. Next slide, please. The other thing that goes along with my frequent flyer miles is a lot of hotel stays. And you know, I've had situations, and this is an honest to goodness story, where I've been in 3 or 4 cities in a week. And I remember in particular one night I was in all day meetings, and then we had a dinner, and I came back to the hotel and I was beat. I went up and I put my key in the door, and of course it didn't work. So I trudged back down to the lobby and Go up to the front desk and I'm like, hey, my name's Kirk Perry. I'm in this room and my key, I must have demagnetized it on my phone. She took my key and she looked at my room. She's like, you're not in that room. I'm like, oh, this room. She goes, no, you're not in that room. And I said, oh, what room am I in? She gave me the room number. But the room number I had given her was the hotel I was staying at the night before in New York. So I was a day behind on my room. But the other thing is when I'm traveling, you get out of your car after a long flight or out of the cab and you go to the hotel lobby and you're queued up to check in. And then, so Hilton created this incredible utility where you can check in on their app. You get your phone downloaded with a key to your room. So you avoid the lines totally. And then I check out at the end of my stay. Now, that's utilitarian. It's very basic, but it's very differentiated in the industry. And so when I have a choice, I will choose a Hilton property because they make it so easy for me. And I know it sounds silly, but back to the points of difference. What makes you unique and differentiated versus your competition? And this to me is something that a lot of times we overlook in business, but it's the most fundamental thing to staying around for the long term because there's something about you that is different that a customer or a consumer wants to have. Next slide, please. The other thing is if you're going to fail, and this is something I have learned painfully, fail fast and fail cheap. When I came from P&G, we were very much into there is a checklist of things we do before we bring an innovation to market or buy a business or sell a business. And those things are the right things to do. But it would take a couple of years to build something that was going to be a long-term plan. It would take a couple of years to launch a new toothpaste flavor, a couple of years to launch a new deodorant flavor. It takes an awful long, you guys can probably build buildings faster than that, but it's because we went through all of these check steps. And one of the things I've learned at Google is we are constantly experimenting. We are constantly failing. We're failing fast. We're failing cheap. And I would tell you that's one of the most liberating things is when a culture can build in this notion of we're going to try things and we may not succeed, but we're going to keep trying. We're going to keep iterating and we're going to find that breakthrough. And a lot of times we tend to lean to we're going to be perfect in our execution versus excellent in our execution. And there is a significant gap between those two things, but being in time in terms of how long it takes to get from one to the other. But if you can go with excellence and fail, but fail cheap and then come back and get it right, that's where now you may say, well, I can't fail when I put something together that people are going to inhabit. I totally get that. But I also believe that there's other things we can test around the margins that aren't going to impact people's lives. Like, obviously making sure the building stands up. But there are going to be opportunities for us to fail fast and fail cheap. And again, I heard Amy talking about culture. And one of the things I'll tell you about a culture that embraces that is they are successful. Because when you can talk in a healthy way about failure, you enable the organization to take smart business risks that enable you to go forward. Jeff Bezos talks about two kinds of risks. One is enterprise risk, which could bring the company down if you make the wrong choice. Therefore, you spend more time and you really get into the details and you don't fail, which is 2 out of 100 cases of risk. 98 cases out of 100 of risk are not enterprise risk. They are about things that if they fail won't take the company down. So how do you go faster on those? How do you take more chances? How do you move things forward? Next slide. I would have partnered with digital category captains to cut through the measurement and reporting complexity associated with this industry. Now, one of the reasons I put up this slide, this is a snapshot of the ecosystems associated with digital advertising. This is how many companies are in this space. It is a cat's breakfast. You can see just tens of thousands of companies squished into this infographic chart. So one of the concepts that I learned from P&G was this, we called them category captains. So when I was running baby care, the family care business, Target would say, hey, Kirk, you guys are the market leader. We want to embed your team in our buying group. We'll give you guys access to all the data. You'll sign NDAs, but you'll literally be able to badge in here at Target. You'll be able to sit with our buyers. You'll see presentations from your competitors. We expect you to be objective, but we want you to help us do planograms, make innovation decisions, but we're gonna give you the keys of the kingdom to do that. We expect 2 things in return. We want to increase foot traffic in our categories, and we want to make sure that we are robustly growing our business. So if we do those two things, we're going to feel great about you being the category captain. And it was amazing, except when you weren't the category captain. So one of the things when I came to Google is kind of looking back when my digital world in the previous job at P&G, this complexity existed. But I would just push the complexity down in my organization. I'm like, man, this is really super complex. I don't know. Do I need an SEM and SEO? Do I need a social media agency? I could go on and on about all the things I should have done, but I just push complexity down to more junior people in my organization, people who are digitally savvy. The reality was that, I was just pushing complexity down and not solving any problems. If I would have gone back and done a parallel to what my retail customers did with me of creating digital category captains, this would have been saying, hey, Google, hey, Facebook, hey, Twitter, hey, digital advertising agency, whoever it was, I would have said to them, hey, help me with this. Be my partner. You're going to sign an NDA. You're going to be under the tent. But I expect these two things in return: efficiency and effectiveness, breakthrough, increased sales, all the things that I want to have as my KPIs. What's your equivalent? What is so complex in your industry that you try to do it yourself? Whoops, my Google phone just went off because I said that. So it's listening, which is good. But if I did it right, I would have said, hey, what is it that I'm trying to solve that I can't do on my own? Because what I've also found in working with a lot of industries is that there are core competencies, things that only you can do for yourself. But there are other things that I'd say, hey, off-the-shelf technology or partners can fill those capability gaps. So a lot of times when I look at my business, I try to segment them and say, okay, what are things that I will always invest in, that I will want to make sure that I deliver against? Always. But what are those things that I should think about partnering with someone on? And so it's transformed my thinking in a lot of ways. And I would just challenge you and think about it for your industry. What is your equivalent of this infographic? What is super complex that isn't in your core competency that you have to solve for, that you may need to partner on, or that you may need to have the equivalent of a category captain help you sort it out? Next slide, please. And this will be the last point, and then I want to open it up for some questions. But I would have reframed innovation to think about it differently, because when I was at P&G, and in your industry, every industry worth its salt is always thinking about innovation, because innovation is the lifeblood of any company. I don't care if it's administrative innovation, marketing innovation, construction innovation, product innovation, whatever that happens to be, it is the lifeblood of companies. But when I was at P&G, I didn't have a framework to think about, because we'd make the toilet paper a little more absorbent, or we would make the diaper. We put graphics on the front of the diaper. We would make a different flavor of toothpaste. I mean, we would always make these small upgrades. And so my thinking around innovation was that we would be constantly making these little upgrades, and maybe once a decade, you'd have something transformational. So when I came to Google, I was really blown away by how Google thought about innovation. It wasn't just, hey, a better flavor of toothpaste, but how do we change the world? How do we transform things in a way that will completely change the way a consumer interacts with something? And we created an organization called Google X, which literally tries to transform the world. And I'm going to talk about a few of those innovations. Many of those don't see the light of day. But the fact that we're working on them, but as I put up here, evolution, revolution, and transformation, my framework is, and how I've evolved over time to think about this, is 70% of our resources, our time, and our money should be put on what I'd call the core or the evolution, right? The things that we have to do. So an example at Google is 7 or 8 years ago, when you type in a Google search, you'd have to get the spelling just about right to be able to get a query that made sense based on what you typed in. Now, if you type in 3 or 4 letters, we're going to give you 5 or 6 options, and odds are one of those options it's an anticipatory search query for you. And we know based on some of your search history what you may be asking. So we're anticipating that and trying to make it quicker and easier for you. That's core evolutionary focus. 70% of our resources are put against that. Then there's the next 20%. So it's 70% on the base, 20% on the revolution. What are those things that you're pulling out of your core that are going to be next gen? So again, using search as the example, we have image search now, where you can take Google Lens You can put it on, the other night, my wife was looking at some furniture, and we said, we wonder what kind of wood this is. So we took Google Lens and we put it on there and asked it what kind of wood it was. And it said, it's oak. And, it was stained. And so we couldn't tell from the grain what it was. And it ended up being oak. But it's an image search or a audio search. Put the button and say, and talk into the phone what you want your search to be. And it becomes an audio search. So we've created this revolution on just typing in your search to both audio and visual. And then there's transformation. And this is about 10% of your organization. And this is about those things that are going to obviate industries, that are going to completely transform the way you do business. And one of the examples for us is on artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, in the way I simplistically think about it, is machine learning takes an incredibly large data set. You apply parameters and rules, and you ask it to solve a specific problem, and it will give you an output. And it does that in incredibly fast timing in a way that none of us could have comprehended 10 years ago. Artificial intelligence then takes that output and says, hey, human beings would take that output and apply how we think about things. And this would be the anticipated, so what? What do I do with that? And the potential answer. And so how that plays out for us is we have the Waymo driverless car division. And this is and we've built in the artificial intelligence simulator that if something falls in a road, is that a power line? Is that a tree? Is that a stop sign? Is that a person? Because that will dictate what that driverless car does with that new stimulus that just fell across the road. That's where artificial intelligence comes into play. And that's such a transformational tool. We are dedicating time, effort, and resources to that. But if you step back, I believe your organization should be 70, 20, 10. Now, sometimes you might be 75, 15, 10. Sometimes you might, be heavier on the top, 20%. But generally, if that gets out of whack, if you're not thinking about this as an evolution, revolution, transformation, then you're either going to be thinking about the future too much and betting on the future and forgetting about today, or you're going to be too focused on today and meeting Friday's payroll that you're not going to be innovating. And you're going to end up like an Alta Vista. You're going to end up like a Netscape Navigator, or you're going to end up like a BlackBerry. And next slide, please. And so for us, and I'll finish up with this and open it up for questions. For us, we're working on things like, ironically, we just shut this down last week. So sorry, because when I put this slide in a few weeks ago, we were still doing this. But in the upper left-hand corner, this is what we call Project Loon. And that was a hot air balloon that we'd float into the jet stream, and we actually beam Wi-Fi back down to Earth. And we've been testing that and experimenting with that in the remotest parts of the world to try to get information into the world of people who have no connection to that world. And this was an example. So we've been experimenting this for 6 or 7 years. This was a fail fast, fail cheap. This was a long-term burn, would have been a 20 to 30-year project. And we just pulled the plug a couple of weeks ago. To the right of that is a contact lens, a joint venture with Novartis. This contact lens has the world's smallest microcomputer on it. You put it in your eye. You have an app on your phone. And for people who are diabetic, it measures your blood, your glucose levels. And that would tell your body, or it would tell your app if you need an insulin shot, or if you had a pump, how much that pump should release. Revolutionary, transformational. And then we have in the lower left our drone delivery service, which we're actually experimenting with right now in Australia and the US and in Latin America. Really encouraging. We can zoom to you, Taco Bell, from store to door at 70 miles an hour, intact, cold and hot, and drop it to within a 12-inch radius of where you ordered it from. It's pretty amazing technology, and it will continue to revolutionize how we get things. And then our driverless car. We've been working on that. When I started at Google, we've had it going for a few years. So we've had it going for about 10 years now. And I call it the Gandhi effect. When I first started at Google, we met with some of our OEM partners in the auto industry. They kind of pat us on the head and go like, oh, how cute, Google's making a driverless car. And I call it the Gandhi effect because first they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. I should say first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then they win, then you win. And in that way, we have accelerated the adoption of this technology. We're never going to make driverless cars, but everybody's worried we were. But we are great at information and we are great at software. So we're developing the technology that is going to drive driverless cars. And that's an amazing thing. And these are examples of transformational technology. As I gave you the example, we killed Project Loon 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago. And that's an example of like saying, pulling the plug and saying, okay, it's not going to work. But these other things are continuing to go because we're investing in them and we know they're going to transform. And so step back. Is your organization 70, 20, 10? So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to open it up for questions if there are any.
Kirk, you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. I don't think you can see it. I don't have a device up here, just a pen and paper, but it is full of notes that I've taken on your presentation. And so, no, thank you. Our industry desperately needs an evangelist that preaches this message and shows us the way. We are probably one of the most lagging industries in our economy, yet we self-proclaim to be the biggest industry in the United States economy, and yet at the same time, we lag in what you've shared. And I believe that one of the reasons for that is the spokespersons for this sort of thing are missing in our business. And it leads us to one of the first questions we had, and that's this. The tug of war, the tension created between the millennials and the boomers. I mean, you're obviously, you said your birthday was somewhere in the 60s. So I did the math real quick and I figured, yeah, he's probably approaching the latter part of his career. Yet you are an enthusiastic evangelist for innovation, for change. How in the world do we inculcate that mindset that you've just expressed so eloquently into a culture and even a business, an industry rather, that's so set in its ways? You said there are disruptors at times that kind of will come to us, and Rich Bainey, you probably know, I don't know if you know Rich or not, maybe he's listening, former chairman of Scripps, you'll know the Scripps organization there in town. But he said yesterday that out of chaos and crisis comes tremendous opportunity. So those disruptors are going to bring it to us, but before we get smacked around in the ocean of uncertainty as an industry, help us. What can be done? And by the way, both Procter & Gamble and Google are actively part of us in the construction organizations. I'm sure that you probably knew several of the directors and ADs who over the years have been a part of us. Some are listening right now, actually. But help us for those industries that are reluctant to change, like Ebenezer Scrooge before the three spirits. What can we do? Is there hope for us?
Well, here's what I tell you. I know my gray hair, my white hair gives it away. So I'm not a millennial, shockingly to most of you watching this. But when I came to Google, I tell this story often. The first year was the hardest year of my professional life, maybe my entire life, because I came from something I was, the boiled frog syndrome, right? I grew up in a world, I spent 23 years there. I didn't feel the water boiling. I just kind of stayed in it, right? And it was only when I jumped out of the water and I went into a different industry was I able to see how different things were. And I think sometimes the danger is when you become too insular or too sort of, this is what we do, it makes it hard to change. So what I've learned to do is I had to obviously learn how to be a digital player. I had to learn about digital in a way that I never had to do when I was at Procter & Gamble. But I would take like 15 minutes every day and try to learn something new about my industry, other industries that are coming down the road. So I would, for example, the blockchain technology, which is what publicly is talked about as like Bitcoin, right? That is a very, very complex topic. It isn't just currency. It's a whole infrastructure behind that called blockchain. So I spent a lot of time really, what does that mean? What does that look like? It's going to revolutionize payments at some point, but it's also going to revolutionize processing and inventory and, making sure that produce shipped from Mexico is fully accounted for and we know exactly when it was picked and when it was in store. I mean, it's going to revolutionize things in ways we have no comprehension of today. That's going to have a lot of impact on the industry. So that's an example of something I wanted to learn. The other, so one is just you got to have a learning mindset. and not be afraid of it. It was like once I dove into the pool, I stayed in. It was cold, so it took a while for it to warm up. But I had to move around and I had to learn things there. The other thing is, it's back to what I talked about failure. A lot of times, why people don't want to take risks is because you don't want to fail. It's a natural human reaction, right? But you have to do it. You have to fail. And I know I kind of tongue in cheek said, well, you can't have buildings collapse. I completely understand that. But there are ways you can innovate around how you order, how you pay, you can innovate any system or any process, but it's about taking that chance. And then I think the other thing is it's a cultural, what I have seen at Google, it is a culture of continued learning and continued pushing of the envelope. Like I said, I gave examples in innovation. The company is not like, I never had done this at P&G, but we've launched things at Google and pulled them back. Like, I don't know what the equivalent would be in the construction industry, but imagine you're preparing something for a period of time, you launch it to the marketplace and then you pull it back. Never did that. We do that all the time. We'll launch something and it's not quite ready for prime time. Like, okay, we'll pull it back in, we'll fix it, we'll get it back out. But it's just this culture of constantly trying to, reframe who we are and continue to grow. And I think that all comes from like your North Star. Who are you? What do you want to be? What is your mission? And I think when you have a super clear mission, a culture that supports that mission, and an ability to, experiment, learn, and continue to grow, that's where change comes from. And it doesn't have to be overnight. I've seen companies, like there's a book, one of my favorite business books of all time is Jim Collins' Good Great. And he talks about, this whole idea of companies like Nucor Steel. Like they didn't even make steel. They just said, what can I be best in the world at? What are my core competencies? And what's my economic engine? And where those three circles came together for them was, we're going to innovate how steel is made. And they became this like huge industry disruptor. They swung wildly and then crushed a home run. And I think that is, for me, how I think about that. Like, how do you do that systemically, but you don't have to do it overnight?
What attributes or characteristics do you as an organization, not you personally, and maybe you personally, but certainly your organization, look for in new hires? One of the challenges we have, I think, is that tension also with the kids coming out of the University of Cincinnati, right? Best in the world.
Okay.
I'm a two-time alum, as is, for those of you who don't know, as is my buddy Kirk here as well. But what attributes and characteristics are you looking for in your new hires to assure that they can be a part of that cultural revolutionary change? Are there certain attributes that Google looks for that may not be prevalent as we vet others that are coming into our businesses?
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty consistent across the org, whether it's product, engineering, or the business side. We want people who are intellectually curious, because if you're intellectually curious, you're going to continue to learn all the days of your life. Mm-hmm. And you can tell whether someone's intellectually curious. Like, tell me about the most recent book you've read, or tell me what you're interested in outside of work. Tell me what was the most interesting class you had outside of your major. There are easy ways to tease that out. And you can find out if someone is really curious about the world or about learning new things from pretty simple questions. I'd say the other thing is, and something I look for personally, is resiliency. I think if anything, this pandemic has taught us there is no up and to the right in anything we do, right? There will always be bumps in the road. There will be mountains and there will be valleys in our lives. And you want people who can fight through that. You want people who can climb that mountain and back up that mountain. And, this tested everyone. I mean, when businesses are shut down, when you can't get people on your job sites, when you can't get people in the office, how do you operate your business? And you find out. I mean, I always say crisis reveals character. And you find out who is tough and who can push through it. And so resiliency, and again, that's one where you can tease that out. I always ask the question in interviews, what's the most difficult thing you've ever faced in your life? And how does it impact how you operate today? And it's so interesting, the answers you get. And the last thing I would tell you is we look for problem solvers, right? We look for people who don't take no for an answer, who don't stop when it seems like there isn't a solution, because there is always a way to figure something out. Elon Musk talks about, when he interviews people for Tesla or SpaceX, he asks people, like, what's the most challenging problem you've solved? And he said the way you can tell if people who solve really tough problems are very meticulous and very detail oriented in their answers. And they can go through with incredible precision, even though you may not know anything about the problem they've solved. By the way they've described that problem and how they went about solving it, you know they're legit and that they've solved this on their own. So those are three huge things. And then obviously, we want people who can communicate well. We want people who are strategic thinkers. But to me, those three, and it's such a competitive world today, right? I mean, it's, as Thomas Friedman said, the world is flat, right? So we're drawing, pools of people from all over the world working in our industries, and we're competing against people who are super smart in other places in the world now for the first time, over the last decade, in a way that we never had before, because the internet has democratized everything. And so you guys can have competitors sitting in another part of the world who can do things that, you used to be able to do because you were right next door to your customer. It doesn't matter anymore, because people can actually do that. So the talent acquisition it is the most critical thing we do. I mean, I always say, if you subtract the market cap of your company and take out your property, plant, and equipment, that delta, that difference between the hard assets you own and the market cap, is your people. Because without your people, there's no brand. There's nothing that you can do without the people in your organization. So if you're not hiring, training, and retaining the very best people, and I'll tell you, I've been blessed to work for two of the most iconic companies in the world, in Procter and in Google. And just the smartness levels, I'm never the smartest person in the room ever. I'm never under the delusion that I'm the smartest person in the room, because there are some super smart people. But what's great is the mix of having people like their IQs are off the charts, but then you have people who just have incredible EQs and they can slog things out and they're tough and resilient. And you mix those together, and that's the magical fuel mixture to me, because you can find people with both.
That's a great soundbite, by the way. I love it. I understand from our production room that we have a couple of questions in the queue.
Sure.
So, Greg, what do you have in the queue for our listeners? And by the way, for those of you who are just tuning in, we're talking to Kirk Perry, who's president of Global Client and Agency Solutions for Google. Google's one of our newer members at the Construction Users Roundtable. So proud to have them a part of us. And I'm sure many of them are listening now. And for those Google associates who are listening, Kirk just hit a home run there for our conference. And we're so proud to have you folks on board, and so honored to have Kirk with us. Greg, what's come in from the queue that you're monitoring?
Our industry demands good collaboration amongst companies and people. Industry groups like Kirk, who want to innovate, also need great levels of collaboration amongst people. But a lot of tech seems to be isolating people more than ever. Depression amongst teens is alarmingly high because of social media. We are losing our connection to each other. What responsibility does the tech industry owe to solving serious problems which they largely created?
Number one, do you agree with the assumption?
So here's what I tell you. We have a huge responsibility, right? I mean, as Peter Parker's uncle says in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So of course we have tremendous responsibility in all this, and we are doing everything we can to make sure, because, it's not as simple as, if you do this, then that will happen. I mean, when you think about it, right, a lot of times what happens over time is we figure out an equilibrium. We figure out, hey, how much time do I need to spend on this device, or how much time do I really need to spend? For me, I never spend time on social media. Maybe it's my age, but for a period of time I did. I'm like, I don't get a lot of value out of that. So we have to put things in place that allow people to have choice, and that's the biggest thing, right? Is members of a free society, we should give people choice. And we should build in safeguards to give them that choice. And that's, one of our philosophies as a company, is to make sure we give people choice. Things on our YouTube platform, for example, we have been working so hard over the last 4 years to root out all the craziness that can happen on a platform. And we have been dedicated to that. And we had some slip-ups 3 years ago for brand safety, we call it, where we had advertisers advertising against content that shouldn't have been advertised against. And so we had to, the way we describe it is we went from being a town to a metropolis, and we didn't have enough infrastructure to handle that metropolis. And so we invested millions of dollars in getting it right. And we still have a long way to go. But we're getting to where we need to be. And I would, and I can't speak for other platforms, but I think as an industry, we have a responsibility to make sure we are not a harm, but we are a good. It's that old challenge, right? Where, hey, fire is amazing. Fire in the wrong hands is a bad thing. So how do you leverage what's great about fire, but make sure fire doesn't become a danger to people and buildings and other things? So it's at finding that balance of the good and make sure we can root out the things that aren't good about it. And I think we're moving in the right direction. I think people have stepped up, and I think, our country has become so divided over the last 4 years. And I think we're starting to see things change in that regard from, hey, how can we as platforms step up and make sure we're part of the solution if we're not getting things from the center?
Another question that came, thank you for that. Another question that came in is, if you're not spending time on social media, and you mentioned reading Good to Great, where are you spending that time where you refresh and you re-energize and you become intellectually curious? Books, other resources? What's Kirk Perry following?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So oh, hold on. I've got a book here. I want to hold.
Yeah, you're good.
So so first of all, my faith is really important to me. So every day I try to spend time with the one who created me. So that's a really important thing for me to get my day started. But I do, social media is not a way I learn at all. I'm a history buff. I love learning from other people who've been through experiences who can give me insight. I'm an avid podcast listener. In fact, my favorite podcast is from a good friend of mine from Cincinnati, Brian Tome, called The Aggressive Life. So there's a plug for him. But there's a book I just read called One Step Closer. It's a my free plug of the day.
By the way, Greg Palmer, why don't you put that in the group chat and let the folks know it? Who's the author, Kirk?
So Ryan Atkins, A-T-K.
Oh, I know Ryan. Yes, from CHCA, and he had that terrific accident.
Yep.
Yes.
But it's a book that the punchline is Ryan was a superstar, brilliant, one of the most premier programs at the University of Cincinnati, had a horrific car accident, paralyzed from quadriplegic. But it talks about how he finds joy every day, even though he lives a life that most of us would consider, something that would be horrible. He finds joy in it. And it just was such an uplifting book. I just finished Ron Chernow's Hamilton. I've seen the play, but I had to go back and read the book again. I love the juxtaposition of history. And one of the reasons I'll give this one more thing about that. One of the reasons I love that book is because when you look back in history, while we believe we're really divided right now, when you study history, the elections of 1796, 1800, 1824, 1876, and even right before World War II, there was half the country that believed we should be in isolation and the other half believed we should be interventionists. And so our country has been as divided, if not more in the past, and we've come through it. So I find hope, because I think if you learn from your past, then you can impact your future.
Wow, that might be a nice spot to end, since we're about 30 seconds over. I want you to repeat that again. I want everyone to listen. By the way, you've got about 500 people listening to you from different companies and some even around the world. What was that last soundbite? It's wonderful and way to end.
What I said, if you can learn through history about your past, then you can actually have an impact on your future. And I wouldn't say that exactly the same as before, but the notion is, how do I make sure I learn? What my definition of wisdom is what works and what doesn't work. And then how do you make sure that you either apply that or not apply it going forward? You can be a 15-year-old man or a 55-year-old boy. But to me, it's about how do you apply those learnings and those wisdom points in your life for the good going forward.
That sounds like another Brian Tome soundbite as well. By the way, Kirk and I, when he was in Cincinnati anyway, attend the same church. We're referring to the pastor there at Crossroads. And I will take just a moment of personal privilege, Kirk, and thank you for one of my passions is Crossroads Uptown and all the generous things that you have done, not only for the community, you and your wife personally, but also for the University of Cincinnati. He's a two-time Bearcat, first-gen college grad, like I know you were. I've heard the story many times. Sure. You have lived generously. And that has been an inspiration as well as an encouragement to me personally. And I'm glad that after a year of incessant emails, we finally made it work. The irony is I'm left town and I'm in a production studio in Lexington while you've come all the way back to Cincinnati. So I missed the opportunity to shake your hand personally. But it is a joy to have done life together with you for this past hour. And we thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kirk. So as we bid Kirk Perry adieu, I'll take just a moment and encourage you to, again, give us your survey response to Kirk's presentation. It's in the conference app. You select agenda, you go to Tuesday, click this presentation and click survey and simply give us your feedback.